throughout the country. But growing up in South Africa, it was really just kind of living under a bubble with just being very kind of like unaware of what was going around you in terms of the apartheid system. So as a kid growing up, you're a kid. You're not really politicized. You go to school. You play a sport. You go bar mitzvahs. It was just a great kind of a life to grow up in South Africa. We lived in a nice 4-bedroom house with a swimming pool. Initially everything was like open, like in the States with no walls, and kind of as crime and violence started to become more and more prevalent, South Africa is kind of known for its wonderful walls. Talking about walls in this country, but every house has this wall, and you kind of separate just to keep kind of everybody out of their homes. So it's a very kind of surreal type of lifestyle where you live very well, but you're very kind of isolated. In terms of Jewish life, it's pretty homogeneous. The South African Jewry is predominantly an Orthodox community, so it's very patriarchal. It's men lead the service, women are very kind of upstairs in the balconies, men are downstairs leading the service. Quite a big influence from the States. Our rabbi, my rabbi growing up was from Brooklyn, Lubavitch. Although we were all kind of like very, I would say it's conservadox. So it's an Orthodox type of service. None of us were. Some were kosher, some weren't kosher. People. Friday night Shabbat was a big service, so everybody came. So the majority of people came for service on Friday night. My clear memories of growing up Jewish is like for Friday night family. Shabbat we used to alternate at our house and at my grandparents' home, and there were like at least 10 or 12 different people from different generations in the family, and that was a tradition like my whole life growing up in South Africa. But come Saturday morning, it was off to play soccer and off to the mall, and so it was an Orthodox. It's Orthodox, but it really was conservative kind of lifestyle. As I said, it's grew up in South Africa in the apartheid system, very much a bubble. South African Jews are, I'd say, kind of like armchair liberals. Obviously they're more left and they never kind of openly supported the nationalist apartheid government, but they very much kind of benefited from the system. There are a lot of individuals who were who would be anti-apartheid, outspoken against the system. But on the whole, I would say the South African leadership, the Zionist Federation and the Jewish Board of Deputies, these are like kind of the big organizations, the big leadership organizations, were relatively silent in terms of coming up and being vocally talking out against the inequities of the South African system. And I think they just didn't want to rock the boat. I mean, they obviously they're concerned with the safety of the South African Jewry, and so everyone is kind of tacitly just complicit in the whole system by not really like being outspoken and being opposing the system. So because of that, even though they were like there were Jews who were prominent in the African National Congress and in the Parliament opposing the government, I'd say on the whole, most people like us in general life just went on and lived our lives and were kind of oblivious to the suffering of the millions of people around us. We had the only Black African people that I knew were the maids that worked in our homes, and they had this little room, a little kind of kitchenette and a bathroom, and they lived on the side of the house. And it was just a lady that worked in our home the whole day, and kind of, we knew her by her first name, and she would call my parents like madam and master. I mean, that's the way it was, and it was like, this is the norm. You know, there was a respect, but it was a very like, like kind of a servant employee kind of relationship. And also, they were split from their families. So the lady that worked with us, her husband lived somewhere else, and the kids were probably with the grandparents in the rural areas, and so the whole family was split. And I kind of only became aware of this once I got to university and started like actually have African students like who lived in the townships in like Soweto and other townships, and I became you know, more aware of what's actually going around me. And also I studied medicine, so we went to hospitals within the township, and all of a sudden became kind of like an open eye to like people are living in these shanty towns with like open sewage in the streets and no running water and very little electricity, and we like going home, and it's almost like a highway. On one side was this abject poverty, and the other side is this immense affluence, and there's this kind of something which I was almost unaware of growing up in primary school, in elementary school, high school. And it's also because the government was a very kind of regime type government. They controlled the media, schools, all the schools were we went to a white school, a public school, we went to a public high school, we went to a Jewish day school, elementary school, but a public high school. But it was all completely white. And you know, the black Africans and the Indians went to different schools, the whites went to their schools. Huge discrepancy in terms of the standards of education and in terms of the amenities that they all have. And that really only became apparent when I got to high school. And on to university. And university was kind of like, I said, like the protests of the states had in Vietnam, where there's a lot of student activism, a lot of protests against the South African government and against apartheid, and it was scary at times that they would have these peaceful protests, and the South African police and the army would arrive in these massive military trucks that would line up. They would come on campus with full riot gear, give you like 5 minutes to disperse. Everybody just sat down kind of peacefully, and then they would just open fire with tear gas, and they would charge the students with whips and beat them up. And a lot of active students, I mean, I was not active as a leadership role, but a lot of the students who were active leaders were arrested without charge, or like put in solitary confinement. A lot of them would disappear, were tortured. It was a scary time, and my parents were like, don't be involved, don't jeopardize your education, go there, get your, do your studies. They were very scared to be, for me to get involved, because the consequences were, scary. You could be arrested.
Now, do you want to, because you need to wrap up.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll be time for questions. Do you want to finish up about what you were just saying, or do you want to say something about what motivated you to leave?
Yeah, so I'll close up. So I finished my university studies, and it was in the late 80s, like 1989, 1990. There was still a lot of uncertainty as how the future of the country was going. Mandela was still in jail in Robben Island. There was a lot of violence, a lot of crime. People just didn't feel safe, and I just didn't feel that, I wasn't sure how the situation was going to turn out, whether there was going to be a peaceful transition of power, was going to be some bloody uprising. And so once I finished my university training, I decided to leave, and there was a South African Jewish doctor in Philadelphia who had an opportunity for me to go study with him and do some research, and so I took the opportunity and kind of came across to the States and studied here and did further residency training and kind of stayed. And my family, my brother ended up going to Australia, and subsequently my parents moved to Australia, so most of our immediate family is actually out, although we still have family, and thank God the South African the transition turned out to be peaceful, and people are kind of thriving there, and there is obviously a big change for the positive in South Africa.
Great, thank you. Questions for?
During the migration period, I believe that, and I'm probably saying it incorrectly, that they could not take money, the Krugerrands?
Grand, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yet, you know, there's so many South Africans I personally have met, many of them physicians, but, so with your family who went to Australia, I mean, or other families that you know from South Africa, how did they deal with that?
So there was foreign exchange control because the South African government was worried that people would like just take all their money and leave. So there was a limited amount how much money South Africans could take out. And so, as the leader said, like the Jews have a way of getting money out. So they kind of, people saw the money writing on the wall, and they got money out like illegally. They took it in Krugerrand, which are gold coins. They took out, if students were, I remember traveling overseas, and they would, if somebody was going overseas and you were going as a student traveling, somebody would pay you to take 10,000 rand out the country. They would give you a commission, and when you got there, you just give it to some other family members. So people kind of got money out by hook or by crook. I left when I didn't have any money, so.
Another question for Alan Moore. Great, thank you. Ollie Cohen next.
Hi, thank you for an opportunity to speak. So I was born and raised in southeastern Siberia, Russia, and I spent about 21 years there, so I have a pretty good perspective of growing. I was growing in the Soviet Union, and I kind of lived through the collapse of Soviet Union, and then what became Russia and the former Soviet Union. They left for Israel in 1992, somewhat later than many other people, as the massive Aliyah immigration started in late 80s. Just to kind of, my family, both my parents come from Ukraine, and from major, from the places that had large Jewish population. My mother is from Vinnytsia, which is not far from Kiev, and my father's from Odessa, which also had a pretty large Jewish population. And for different reasons, people ended up in Siberia, mostly socioeconomic reasons that drove people over the years into different Siberian towns and cities, away from the centers like Moscow and Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg. My maternal grandfather was in the army, was a major in the Soviet army stationed in Berlin after the war, and in 1948, Stalin, in preparation for repressions against Jews that he didn't really succeed, he died before that, but one of his first steps was to take a lot of Jewish officers stationed in central parts and abroad and move them deep into Siberia. So that's how my grandfather ended up being moved very far deep into a Siberian garrison, and then he retired from the army in 1953, and the family stayed. My grandfather on my father's side, they moved later. He was a radiologist, and the situation, the anti-Semitism in Ukraine was pretty strong, both sort of hostile on the street, where you could get beat up for just being a Jew, as well as sort of cultural, where you couldn't find a job, where you couldn't get into college. So he just couldn't find a job, and in search of a job, he moved to Siberia. A lot of people, what I saw growing up in Siberia, moved to sort of, again, away from Ukraine and Belarus and central parts because of the opportunity. Less than a threat, more an opportunity, like to find a job. A lot of Jewish people could not get into a decent college in Moscow, so they migrated. They went elsewhere if they wanted to pursue a career in science, they would move to Siberia because they could still get into a good university and get a good education. Those who managed still to get into a university in Moscow, then they had problems actually getting a job. So they ended up moving further and further. What Siberia had was a major development after the war in terms of science. They built more institutes and research centers, so there were a lot of Jews. I lived in a city that had 800,000 people. The Jewish community was about 3,000, which was pretty small. It's about 0.37%. Jews were about 0.67% of Russia, which was very little, but my town was very small community, mostly professional. So it's people who are lawyers and doctors and scientists, and I sort of, when I grew up, I didn't know other Jews than people with higher education. And when I landed in Israel and I started seeing Jews doing other things like painting houses, that was sort of very unusual for me. Growing up, I always felt I was different. Siberia did not, as I said, at least early on, we didn't have the hostile anti-Semitism. It was more cultural, more sort of sophisticated. There was no real physical persecution. Again, in Ukraine, like when my dad grew up, he had to learn to fight because he would fight on the street because he would get picked up by, he would be approached by Ukrainians and they would try to steal money. That wasn't really the case in Siberia. It was more, you just feel different. So growing as a little Jewish boy, I was always different. I look different. There are not a lot of people who look like me in Siberia. So even in the kindergarten, kids would tease me because I would look different. And they would not call me a Jew, they would call me Armenian or Georgian or something like that. But for a lot of people, the fifth column in Russia, all your documents, it's not the religion, it's your, they call it nationality, but it's not. It's really your identity, so they're Russians and they're Jews. And it's in all your documentation, in your birth certificate, in your passport, in every document that you fill out, just like what you mentioned. So everybody knows you're Jew. A lot of people try to hide it. So they would pay somebody to have it changed, but their names would stay Jewish names and last names, and everybody would still know who you are, but that was the sort of the tendency by some people. That's what the situation was. As the time progressed and the Soviet Union collapsed, the borders opened and a lot of people started packing. What was also happening is that even in Siberia, the sort of cultural anti-Semitism turned into more violent on the street kind, so you could, even I experienced a couple times people approaching because everything was collapsing and it was just a result of that. The decision to leave was, I think it was my family. Like I left and I never looked back. Growing up different and spending so many years, I don't miss that place. Although I learned a lot and it's part of who I am and part of who my children are, and but still we were really happy to leave that place behind. I think not a lot of people left there today, at least not in my town. We were probably the last ones leaving. So that's a bit of an overview of my life and how I felt leaving.
Thank you. Questions for Olive?
Just wanted to ask Oleg, what is it like with the people that are there now? Has it gotten any better, or?
It's, I mean, people live better. Everything is, when I was leaving the country, 1992, everything was falling apart. This was probably like, I think 1993 was, they say, the worst year. So a lot of crime, a lot of economic uncertainty. Now people live better. And Jews who stayed there, they're still, again, the same topic, found ways. We always found ways. We were a pretty prosperous family and had connections and had ability to do things. So people who are there now, they find ways, they're fine. Is definitely, at least there was a period when Russia was a lot more free country. The situation was changing, but it's much better than it was back in the day. We couldn't celebrate holidays. There was really no, you could get persecuted. My father would sneak out late at night, go to a place and bring matzah in a pillowcase. And that's sort of the reality of how Jews lived back there. Now it's, there's synagogues, there are rabbis, people go and they could practice religion. So yeah, things are different.
I have one question. So when you just said about having to hide the religion, would you say that at that point that was particular to the Jews, or was that also related to under a socialist regime, everybody had to hide their religion? What?
I think it was specific to Jews, because people had Ukrainian written in their passport, and I never heard anybody trying to change that.
Well,
So,
would they have been able to, let's say, go to church and things like that?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, you had still practicing Russian churches, and you had Polish Catholic churches, but the synagogue was destroyed. I mean, if you saw what was left of it, I mean, they're restored. The only function we had somebody wasn't a rabbi, is to bury people. And we had a Jewish cemetery in town, and that was sort of the only function that survived.
Great, thank you. Next is Eric Unger.
I'm more comfortable standing up than sitting up. Excuse me. I was going to bring along some photographs, but when I was a kid in Vienna, photography hasn't been invented yet. So, as I hinted, I was born in Vienna. I spent my first 13 years there, so it was another time, another place. And since I don't remember too many things, I made a few notes here. Let me some quick background about Vienna. Most of you probably know something about it. A large city in Central Europe. Before World War I, it was the capital of a very large empire. It was an Austro-Hungarian empire. And the Jews had lived in Vienna since about the 1200s. But there were a few Jews. And the Jewish community fluctuated, grew and waned a lot. There were